Okay, if we can't find a John Brown joke, we gotta make a John Brown joke.
What you got there under your Bible?
I was struggling to find a rhyme for Harper's Ferry. I like that one better.
Is that a gun under your Bible, or are you just happy to see me?
Much better. Welcome back to I Want to Date These Guys, a podcast run by two members of the Guy family, one of which unfortunately was struck by a speeding bullet train on her vacation to Japan and will not be joining us this week. Thoughts and prayers to my sister Naomi. For now, I'm Joel Guy.
I'm Lauren Pauls.
And we are back to discuss Sex in the Heartland, Part 2. I am excited to speed through the rest of this because I am convinced that no one wants to listen to 4 parts of a book. And I apologize to Beth Bailey, the author of this book, because she's written an incredible text. And I would strongly suggest that if you're interested in more about this, you find a copy at your local library or purchase one and support her work. Lauren.
Mm-hmm.
This is 2023, 20 Rigatoni, the year where you're supposed to do things to improve yourself while also either being delicious or giving you things you can fill your life with. It's not a really well articulated philosophy, but I think people get the general vibe. But what have you been doing to meet that?
I'm always delicious. That's not debatable. But I have been taking some ceramics classes recently, and it's been really fun and really fulfilling.
This is something some of our listeners might not know about. Most cities in the area offer some variety of arts classes. City of Phoenix, City of Scottsdale, City of Mesa, City of Gilbert, City of Tempe, all of which have introduction to drawing, introduction to photography, metalworking, glass. Not all of them offer the same things. City of Mesa has a particularly well-equipped glass and metal program. But yeah, City of Tempe has a really good pottery studio. What have you been making so far?
I've made a lot of vessels, planters, and pitchers and cups and bowls and stuff like that. I made a little ceramic shelf for my desk at work to hold like little, very small little trinkets. I've made, what else have I made? I made a shot glass. It's got little bubbles on it and some vases.
Nice. You haven't even tried a bong yet?
I haven't tried a bong. I could really easily turn one of my vases into a bong though.
No Klein bottles yet?
No, not yet.
Dang. You're missing an opportunity.
I know.
I'm glad you're having fun, and I'm glad you're using a clay that doesn't rip the skin off your hands.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my gosh. The first class, I used a clay with sand in it to throw, and I'm throwing directly on the wheel. You normally, well, a lot of times you'll throw on a bat, which is like a little mat that goes on the wheel, and it protects your hands. But my ceramics teacher taught me to throw directly on the wheel, which is a little bit rougher on your hands. And then on top of that, I was using clay that had sand in it. The first time I was throwing, in my defense, on Etsy, it was labeled a very fluid throwing clay. It was not.
You gotta build up those calluses. Yeah.
It ripped a giant hole in the side of my hand. And I was like bleeding for days because of the hole in my hand. It was not a fun time, but then I got softer clay and learned how to lift my hand, how to center the clay without having my hand directly on the wheel, and now it's totally fine.
Nice. You got to sacrifice to your art. I'm sorry, just learning this now.
Yep.
I should note for our listeners, we do have 5 cats running around this house. We have done our best to coop them up, but you may hear sniffles or clinking or them running across our keyboards different points. We'll do our best to edit around that, but if you hear any of that, it is not us making cat noises, it is actual cats. I know a lot of people have confused us with cats before.
Meow.
I'm not going to toot my own horn because I don't really have much to toot, but one thing that you're looking
You do when you eat dairy.
It's true. I saw that coming. That's how we should open this podcast. One thing I've been working on this year is kind of like, I wouldn't say restoring furniture, but like trying to repair broken furniture. There's stuff I've purchased from Goodwill, which I like, but as some aspect of it, it's chipped, it's dented, the stains coming off, the wicker is bent. And I have both been acquiring tools and the things needed to replace wicker, to, spray paint it different colors and, add some stain on top. I think it is cheaper to make the furniture you want from, older pieces than buying it wholesale. And given some of the prices I've seen at furniture outlets recently, I'm like, yeah, this is the way to go.
For sure.
So yeah, having a lot of fun with that. It is easier than you would think to replace fabric or other pieces of furniture. You're going to want to work with stuff that's decent quality and not like IKEA. If it has particle board at center, it's probably not worth salvaging. But that's what I've been working on. Lauren, can you briefly summarize part 1?
Sure. In part 1 of Sex in the Heartland, we learned all about how World War II impacted the attitudes towards sex and dating in Lawrence, Kansas, and how both the impact of federal programs changed the way that Lawrencians thought about and acted towards sex, and how the general atmosphere of the population of Lawrence during and immediately after World War II expanded the scope of what was socially acceptable in terms of dating and sex.
That's quite the run-on sentence, but accurate.
Thanks.
I would hate to grade your college essays.
I'm Hemingway.
I don't know if I'd agree with that. I did date you for your love of beating people up in bars. Before we forget, what are we drinking today?
We are drinking some Target brand Good and Gather watermelon lime sparkling water.
Where does this rank on your kind of like personal scale of sparkling water?
Well, let me try it first.
I thought you've had this before.
I wanted to try it again. It's not my favorite, and it's not my favorite watermelon lime. My favorite watermelon lime is probably, or is that one strawberry lime? I can't remember whether the other one is strawberry lime or watermelon lime, but my favorite is probably the AHA red and green box.
You do buy that a lot.
I do buy that a lot.
I think this one just tastes kind of like artificial watermelon, very subtly.
Yeah.
It's
very
not
subtle.
My favorite.
I always say that, and I'm sure I've said this on the podcast, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but I've always said that the mark of a good sparkling water is whether or not it has taste when it's flat. Yeah. And this does not have taste when it's flat.
That makes sense. It's a ethereal. It's a suggestion.
It's a suggestion. Yes. It thought about a watermelon one time.
Yeah. So one more time, I will strongly urge people to pick up a copy of this book, because we will be summarizing a lot of the next 300 pages or so. 300 pages?
Oh my God.
Many pages in this, next hour segment. But it's going to be informative. Come along. So one of the big things that happened in the 1950s that influenced kind of campus culture and how people understood sex in conjunction with young adults was the introduction of the panty raid. Do you know anything about panty raids?
Yes.
Besides something that I guess was in Animal House movies? We'll jump right in. Panty raids broke out like brush fires in May of 1942. 52. At the University of Wisconsin, 5,000 students charged the women's dorms, urged on by bugle calls. At the University of Alabama, women's lingerie was locked in trunks to prevent a raid, and the girls were reduced to throwing socks to the boys massed below their windows. At Indiana University, the director of women's residence halls sent out a barrel full of female undergarments in the hopes that the males would help themselves and go home quietly. At the University of Oklahoma, 2,000 students battled state police in what local authorities politely called a lingerie raid. In Missouri, Governor Forrest Smith called out the National Guard when local police were unable to contain a mob more than 2,000 men who were battering down doors and smashing windows at women's dorms. The Lawrence police, who were called by dormitory officials and sorority house mothers when a large crowd of men began to surround women's residence halls at KU, told the women to leave the doors open and not to resist. They refused to come to the scene, arguing that the students were looking for resistance and that police presence would just incite them. Close to 1,000 men stormed 3 dormitories and 5 sorority homes that night, but only a single pink brassiere was reportedly taken. Alfred Kinsey, inventor of the Kinsey scale,
yes,
when asked his opinion of the panty raids, said simply, "All animals play around." So we talked about in the last episode how national culture could popularize things like necking and changes in dating culture, but it also could popularize abhorrent behavior like this. And I can imagine it might have been maybe just slightly terrifying for women at these
Yeah.
universities as thousands of men barrel through their rooms, digging through their possessions in search of their undergarments. Um, yeah, definitely not a great development. But it also signaled to university administrators that they would have to take a bigger role in
Mm-hmm.
policing the sexuality and conduct of their students. So beforehand, as was discussed in Front Porch in the Back Seat, university administrators were very interested in the sex lives of their students because one of the reasons parents would send their students to schools that were co-ed was because they had been promised by administrators that the conduct of their like young women and men would be in many ways controlled. They would prevent
Mm-hmm.
women and men from hanging out by themselves. They would prevent them from being in the same rooms after 10 p.m. at night. They would impose strict curfews on women and men. And one of the big themes throughout this book is how university administrators' decisions impacted the culture of local universities. Because university administrators have the option of either rigidly enforcing regulations or really backing off and letting people do what they want. And a combination of those two things influenced sex and sexuality throughout this era. It also made them deeply concerned about how sex was impacting young people, not in like a morality way, but in like a danger to other people way.
Mm-hmm.
Like before it was, oh man, you could, get this young girl pregnant and then her life will be ruined because everyone will think she's disreputable. There we go. That's the word I'm looking for. And now it's like, oh my God, our students could be assaulted if we don't keep this in check. So a big thing that develops during this period is, all of these systems of like community advisors and dorm regulations. But another thing that's less discussed that Beth goes into a lot of detail on is the role of psychology. So the reason psychology is so important is because psychiatry as a profession had developed during World War II. And there were a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists left over after the war who
Mm-hmm.
needed something to do, who arguably could easily transition from young men in wartime to young men, many of the same young men, now at college campuses, going about doing their thing. So universities are looking for a way to manage student behavior. Psychiatrists have already developed rules and regulations for controlling people's behavior at the battlefield.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like a natural fit. So she says, faced with the daunting task of managing student behavior, university officials sought new forms of authority and new methods of control over student conduct. Two approaches emerged. The first developed directly from the military use of psychiatry during the war. With a sizable cohort of military-trained psychiatrists and psychologists to draw on, universities attempted to take advantage of their expertise in evaluating and managing large and diverse groups of young people. In shifting some of the authority over student misconduct from deemed as psychiatric, universities redefined certain sexual behavior from misconduct, or sin, meriting punishment, to mental illness, deserving treatment, and so fundamentally changed the way universities handled whole categories of sexual transgression. So psychiatry during the war was interested in primarily one thing. Is the person who we have concerns about going to be suitable on the battlefield?
Mm-hmm.
Are they going to be able to accomplish their tasks
A good
on the
soldier.
battlefield?
Yeah.
Right. They don't care really what the behavior is. They're more concerned of how is this going to impact both the morale of the unit and their ability to perform as a soldier. And in the same way, they take these methods and adopt them to the university. They're not really concerned about whether or not someone's gay. They're concerned about whether or not a gay person could impact anything that's going on at university life. Is this going to impact their studies? Is this going to impact other people? Or are they going to be harm people in their community? So they give a couple of anecdotes. Beth gives a couple of anecdotes throughout this about how people who were gay were treated.
Mm-hmm.
And it varies, but it tends to be that people who were gay were treated as individuals who, quote unquote, needed treatment, not like mental aberrations.
Yeah.
And so there's this whole change during this period from being gay is wrong, we don't want you in this area, to being gay might impact your studies, but if you keep it in check, it's all good and we'll allow you to continue. And that's a big upset. And university administrators have pretty much delegated the task of like determining who's fit to be at universities to psychiatrists. And psychiatrists at the time were like, we have a lot of research that indicates gay people aren't really unfit to do anything in life.
Yeah.
We may not like it, but like just because you're gay doesn't mean you can't go to college and learn how to be a productive member of society. In fact, it's probably better if you stay at college and learn like what good behavior is.
Yeah.
And learn, how to be a good heterosexual. So yeah, they give a number of examples of like gay people being sent to treatment, and at treatment they're like, yeah, we evaluated them, they're probably gay, sure, not an issue, just they have good studies, they're a good student, we think that they would be a good member of the community and they should continue at the university. And again, the question is not whether this person is morally unfit, it's whether or not they're dangerous to the community.
Mm.
So there were instances where gay behavior was punished. And in those instances, it was individuals who like were actively soliciting people on campus for sex.
Yeah.
Or people who were like exposing themselves to other people in public or coercing them into sexual activity. And that's when it was deemed bad. But most of the time when someone like was just caught like talking about their feelings to their professor, it was treated as the normal part of existence and things moved on. Again, really big change during this period.
Yeah.
Homosexuality is no longer dangerous. It's no longer an aberration. It's something that can be managed. So the American Psychiatric Association classified homosexuality as a mental illness, and in the 1950s, virtually all university psychiatrists and psychologists accepted that designation, but that did not mean that they were by nature dangerous to the community or unfit for higher education. And you might think, well, they're the same thing. They're not. At a meeting of the National Association of Student Personnel Administrators in 1952, a psychiatrist told the assembled deans, "I do not think of the homosexual patient as one who goes around corrupting others if the atmosphere on campus is a healthy one. I think of him as being quite a nuisance to others and of being an exciter of anxiety in other people who are struggling with their own latent homosexual conflicts. I do not subscribe to the idea that having such a person on the campus under treatment is going to do him any harm or the campus any harm, as long as he knows that he has to maintain his own personal integrity in that field, just the same as other students have to maintain their heterosexual integrity." So here we have an upset to authority again. University administrators, who you might argue are going to be pretty conservative during this period, whose job it is to keep their students like okay, safe, not getting pregnant, getting up to trouble, have delegated responsibility to authority figures, psychiatrists. Psychiatrists have decided gay people are okay. We don't like them, but they're fine for the community.
Yeah.
And so administrators in turn are like, oh, maybe we shouldn't be actively discriminating against gay people. Again,
That much.
That much.
That much.
Right. So I think often the gay rights movement is characterized as one characterized by one that's mostly protest and direct on the ground activism and visibility. But a lot of this is being done in back rooms where like administrators are being taught by psychiatrists not to worry about gay people.
Yeah.
And they in turn are sort of disseminating those ideas to their student body, which arguably helps launch a lot of the gay liberation groups that form in colleges across the country. When it's no longer a punishment to be gay on campus, and arguably being part of a gay liberation group is probably you being a productive member of the community rather than like being a deviant or whatever. The funny thing is that typically at most colleges around the country that were co-ed, you'd have two separate deans, one for the men and one for the women. A lot of the deans of the men at Kansas University kept detailed files on student misconduct, much of it sexual. These files, such as the one compiled in 1947, when a student named Oral, who was accused of homosexual behavior,
Yikes.
I find that a little funny, appealed for readmission to KU, contained not only memos about the disposition of cases, but also the dean's rough notes, students' handwritten statements, police reports, letters from and to the students' parents, newspaper clippings, and even occasionally notice of death or query from another university or their FBI. The dean of women, in contrast, kept no such files. While the stereotypical dean of women, a prudish spinster obsessed with closing hours and sexual propriety, bears little resemblance to most of the women who act as deans in large universities, the lack of records on women's misconduct is striking because women's sexual behavior normally was more closely monitored than men. Emily Taylor, the dean of women at KU from 1956 to the early 1970s, purposely kept her records cryptic and then destroyed them in order to protect her students. When she noted an inappropriate level of physical affection between two women, she suggested greater propriety in public, not counseling. Obviously, the personality and beliefs of the individual who files an administrative position can make a great deal of difference. Again, kind of the great men theory of individual people who make these decisions and change the course of history. But gender differences in the forms of sexual misconduct also explain the greater visibility of men. Women students' sexual misconduct was mostly normal and unlikely to disturb others or impose upon them. Women were hardly ever exhibitionists or voyeurs. They didn't sexually attack men. Some were lesbians, but they didn't hang out in student union restrooms looking for partners. Instead, the big issue is that they tended to get pregnant. Most secretly found in legal abortion or left school. They were rarely drawn into the therapeutic net. So, in contrast, it's like, lesbians can't get pregnant. Why would we enforce that?
Yeah.
Why is that a big deal? If you're charged by the parents of female students to prevent them from getting pregnant and they're in a relationship with a woman, you win. Yeah, you're doing all of your job. Again, so this is a really, really big change where before, and they gave a couple of examples of like people in the 1920s and 30s who were caught being gay or acting gay at colleges and expelled as a result. And now it's like, oh, you can be gay, and as long as you aren't bothering people, we're not going to bother you that much.
Yeah.
So this is, again, one of those minor things that contributes to this, bigger cultural change in general. Another big thing that changes culture is the pill. The pill emerges in the 1960s. It is an oral contraceptive tablet. Most Americans simply called the pill, and it was approved by the FDA in that year. By 1969, 8.5 million women were using the pill. Their numbers had grown by about 1 million every year from 1961. So there were some side effects, and this was discussed in the media, but because it's more than 99% effective, in no way dependent on the direct cooperation of the woman's partner, and completely separate from an act of sexual intercourse, a great many women were willing to accept the side effects. So here's what's interesting. You would think that at the time there would be a lot of pushback from religious leaders. That really wasn't the case. So, birth control within marriage was a highly charged issue for Roman Catholics. Most other Americans did not see use of the pill within marriage as especially controversial. Nonetheless, by the mid-1960s, the pill symbolized a revolution of sex, and there was a lot of discussion about the morality of the pill in popular culture. So doctors, then as now, controlled access to oral contraceptives. At that time, only a small minority of physicians would prescribe birth control pills to women who were not yet married. Most believed, along with the large majority of the American public, that it was wrong for unmarried women to have sex. Thus, before the pill could play any significant role in the sexual behavior of America's unmarried youth, something had to change. Unmarried women had to have access to oral contraceptives. So how did single women get the pill? Well, it turns out a lot of women would buy cheap rings from drugstores and go to a doctor and be like, "Oh, we're engaged, and I want to check the side effects of the medication." Or they'd say "Oh, my ring's in the shop," or they'd get a friend to come with them and pretend to be there, or even their boyfriend and pretend that they were married. There were a lot of ways of getting around this, and because so many people were doing this, eventually doctors were just like, "Why would we regulate this? Obviously, there's so many ways of getting around it. It's not a big deal." But back to the religious thing. Doctors initially were very hesitant to prescribe things. Religious people were a little more mixed. There were a lot of questions on college campuses, such as whether university health services should be able to prescribe the pill to unmarried women students. This debate, unlike conflict between groups talking about it being prescribed in the community, directly impacted the morality on campus. So there was a forum on campus in KU in 1966 on the topic, should unmarried undergraduates be given birth control information and/or materials through Watkins Hospital, the Student Health Center? There were 3 panelists. Reverend Simmons, the campus minister who'd helped form the family planning clinic and who focused on sexuality counseling and birth control. Father Fultrisk, a chairman of the moral theology department at St. Louis University and a Roman Catholic priest. And Dr. Raymond Schlegler, director of KU's Student Health Service. Who do we think is on the side of prescribing the pill?
Obviously, the first minister.
The first one?
Yeah.
Okay.
And likely the last guy.
The last guy is actually the one who pushes back the most.
Really? Not the Roman Catholic?
So both of the religious individuals are this, we're not a big fan of this, but the bigger concern at the time was not, are unmarried women getting pregnant? It's population explosion. So a big thing throughout this period that was being discussed in national media all the time was how out of control the world's population was getting. There was a small tinge of racism associated with this.
Oh, yeah, of course there was.
There was a lot of concerns that, the world population is growing by 1 million people each year, and those 1 million people were not the proper skin color.
Yes.
But there was also a lot of discussion about the welfare state, and a lot of people concerned that the wrong sorts of people were getting access to their tax dollars. This is the 1960s. This is prior to Reaganism, but there were already this otherizing of certain minority groups in the country. There's definitely a pushback against civil rights era desire for reform to the institutions keeping people poor. But yeah, a lot of religious leaders were actively pushing this idea that in order to control world population and keep the world a habitable place, it was incredibly important that women be allowed to control their reproduction. And the idea was not that taking the pill was murdering an infant or anything, it's often discussed today. It was women need to be able to control their pregnancies in order that at some point in the future they can settle down with a husband and have as many children as they want.
Yeah.
So it was not a tool of allowing free, uninhibited sex. It was a tool of allowing people to make better decisions as part of the nuclear family.
Yeah.
And I found that very fascinating in this section, where a lot of the doctors had, I think, kind of strict views on morality. The Catholic Church was actually pretty permissible in this era. And that's not something that you would expect, given sort of our understanding of history. It's also worth noting that a lot of this coincided with the women's liberation movement. So women now have access to the pill. Women are interested in greater opportunities. You know, they fought through World War II. They've been accepted more into higher education. They're now being accepted into the workplace. And so it only makes sense they want the ability to control whether or not they have children as well. And it's partially, I think, an economic thing, but also partially like a recognition that equal rights means having access and control over their reproduction. I don't know if all women thought of it that way, but I think a lot of women did want that flexibility that just was not available. I mentioned in part one the campus occupation, and that happened in the 1970s. 1972, an author, Robin Morgan, came to speak at KU about women's liberation. And she gave a speech where she talked about the fact that, like, women didn't have control over their health care and that the university was actively standing in the way of this. And so 72 people, I think, 75 women, including university employees, faculty, wives, and undergraduate students, set out and occupied a campus building. They were there for a couple of days, and then the chancellor of the university eventually was like, we're going to come up with some proposals to give you access to, like, birth control and other, like, reproductive options. So there was direct action involved, don't get me wrong, but, like, this was the end result of, like, years of organizing and complaints about the fact that women were struggling for equality, and they thought that, you know, one of the ways to achieve that was the pill. I can't reiterate this enough how much I'm skipping over, because this is such a thoroughly research dense book, but I think it's really important to kind of hammer in the major themes of the text, because the major themes of the text are all things that kind of disrupt people's understandings of this era and gives them a different perspective on how a lot of this progressed. The sexual revolution was occurring during this period. We've used that phrase a lot. And I think a lot of people would associate the sexual revolution with just people having more sex.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that? Do you think there's more
I'd agree with
components?
that. Yeah.
Beth Bailey makes it clear that a lot of the people pushing for liberalization of sex during this period had a variety of different desires. Very little of it was solidarity with, like, gay people. Very little of it was, we want more open sexuality and people should be able to, you know, have whatever relationship they want. It was kind of a culmination of the front porch to backseat idea that youth had learned more and more behaviors were acceptable. Like, it progressed from every interaction with women needs to be in her parents', like, living room to we're making out in the backseat of our car and there really aren't any constraints. And the next logical step then is, well, why isn't sex allowed? And so a lot of people were pushing for that. And it was only rarely that those interests coincided with gay and lesbian liberation as well, though that certainly existed. The problem was that the sexual revolution was never a single coherent movement, so you had some undesirable elements of it. One big thing that was a part of the movement was violent and misogynistic rape fantasies representing sexual liberation that appeared often in underground newspapers.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of, like, hippie zines that were all, like, misogynist incel screeds about how, like, women needed to be available for reproduction at all times. Right? So as much as you have people who think women should be equal, there's also people who are like, society has progressed too fast. Women need to get back to their place in the kitchen. Many who championed sexual freedom were hostile to gay liberation and the personal and political desires of gay men and lesbians. X-rated movies didn't seem too liberating to many who thought many who wanted liberation. Living together for many people was not the same as free love, no matter how often the mass media confused the two. The revolution was an amalgam of movements and impulses joined in the chaos of that era. I think it's really important to note that a lot of the sex liberation happening in Lawrence during this period was connected to drugs.
Yeah.
Do you know much about Lawrence drug history?
I mean, there's a lot of it.
Fair. There's a pretty thriving hippie culture still in Lawrence, right?
For sure. There's a guy who stands on the corner of Mass Street with a sign that says honk for hemp. And he has for the last 20 years.
Incredible.
So,
that's an amazing day job. They say do what you love.
He does what he loves.
So we talked in the first part about how Kansas is kind of the geographical center of the United States. and that has an impact on how drugs flow through the country.
Mm-hmm.
It was certainly because of the university that Lawrence became a regional center for radical politics and cultural experimentation, and geography had a lot to do with Lawrence's version of the 60s as well. It was on this silk route for drugs, as one former merchant wrote later. Huge quantities of drugs passed through the town, moving from both coasts and up from Mexico. Baghdad on the Kaw, some called Lawrence. The Kaw is the river.
Yeah, Cause the river.
With considerably more irony than the journal World had summoned during World War II when it worried about Reno on the Kaw, all of the illegal casinos opening up in the bars. Political and cultural radicals alike knew Lawrence was an oasis in the long drive across the country on US 40. Movement people talked about Highway 40 SDS, for many passed through Lawrence on a trip from coast to coast. Hippie caravans and hitchhikers stopped off for days or weeks in that safe haven on the edge of the West's plains and mountains. Lawrence was like on the Oregon Trail for hippies, someone recalled, and Lawrence people traveled too, out to California and New York, up to Omaha and Madison, and back. Lawrence was a crossroads. Hippies claimed public space and created their own versions of institutions. There were hippie farms and dope fields, and one sociology graduate student had an unheated teepee that he lived outside of town in throughout the long Kansas winter. Lawrence, however, had to deal with this new community, and they didn't always like it. They really didn't like that drugs were being sold pretty much everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
They were abundant and they were cheap. Before 1964, a small number of bohemians experimented with peyote and mescaline, but it began to coalesce in the spring of 1965 when the first acid arrived.
Mm-hmm.
By 1966, marijuana plants were growing wild in ditches just because so many seeds had been distributed and they were being chopped down and sold. Acid and speed swept through town from the West Coast. Some caught the codeine bug, codeine in beer, and POW1, stoned out zombie, stoned across Oread Street, wrote a contemporary chronicler of the drug scene. By 1968, the thing leveled out to casual insanity with cheap acid, psilocybin, cocaine,
mushrooms,
cocaine, hash,
psilocybin,
and good grass from Vietnam and Mexico. There was a lot of bands that came because of the drug culture.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of radicals who came partially because of the drug culture, but also wanting to latch on to those liberatory movements. There were people who came and sort of just wanted to observe all the craziness that was going on. And there's discussions in national press about arriving in Lawrence and just having conversations with naked people wandering down the street as though it was normal. There's a lot of pushback from the community, but by this point, the community of elders that had kind of defined it in the 20s and 40s had dissolved, and there was, I think, a lot more. There wasn't a centralized authority that could push back against this.
Yeah.
And I want to be careful here because I did cut out this whole section on Black liberation. There was definitely pushback to Black liberation demands during this period. But the resources that they had to fight back against certain cultural developments were not what they wanted. And so a lot of this stuff, even though the town was opposed to it, was just progressing too quickly for them to address in a meaningful way. So I think when we're talking about how these trends influence the culture of this period and how people can understand it from other perspectives across the country, it's worth asking, is the area of the country you're looking at one in which a thriving hippie drug culture emerged? Is it one in which people had access to experimentation with psychedelics or other things? And was there considerable pushback from the community? We are just running through this. I'm gonna get you out of here, Lauren. We got things to do, places to be. Okay, so we've talked about sex as countercultural in the sense that it was a pushback against cultural mores of the day. We've also sort of talked about how sex had negative aspects to it, and movements for sexual liberation occasionally were just misogyny in disguise. And I think it's worth drilling down on that because progress is not always uniform, and it's worth understanding how social movements composed of many different facets can still have development, but some of it can be negative. So one of the big things that happened that town leaders absolutely hated was all of the rhetoric that was coming out of the groups pushing sexual liberation and kind of this hippy-dippy stuff going on in the era. One of the annoying things they hated was the use of obscenity in zines and magazines and music. The word fuck became a word of power, one that people would use incredibly liberally. And it was not one that many people had considered socially acceptable up until this point. And a lot of activists realized the power of using subversive language that was considered unacceptable to make the intensity of their feelings known. There are so many examples throughout this text of things written in underground Lawrence papers and local Kansas stuff, photography and poems and music that emerged during this period. But it's certainly also a national conversation as well, where a lot of like the most popular bands of the time are capitalizing on like use of sexually explicit lyrics in order to get people, more counterculture to follow them. It's also a little concerning because the obscene language was kind of weaponized against women, and a lot of women expressed discomfort with how quickly people were becoming accepting of just casual demeaning of their entire sex. And so one of the things that Beth Bailey talks about is there were certain student papers that emerged that talked all about how great sex was and how amazing sex was and how everyone needed to be having sex and all of this. And then women's papers would pop up and they'd be like, we find it deeply concerning that our community thinks of us as only sexual objects, and we think we need to have a more like careful approach to how we discuss sexuality, because sexual liberation is not the same for men as it is for women.
Sure.
Like women still have all of these moral crusaders coming after their life and behavior. It's not so simple as to say that, women can have sex and, escape from the conventions of society. And more importantly, a lot of the activists who are pushing this aren't interested in our liberation. They're just interested in, our naked bodies for entertainment and enjoyment. And so I think that's worth emphasizing that not everyone was with this movement, and there was some pushback happening during this time. I believe the main paper during this period was The Vortex. A lot of people felt that they were fighting not only an oppressive society, but also male co-revolutionaries, which is something that's, I think, discussed a lot in liberation movements throughout this period. One big problem in liberation movements was that there were pushes for equality on the surface, but then when you like dug into them, it was like women doing all of the housework and chores alongside all of their activist work, because the expectation was still in place that they were the homemakers. So they weren't really being liberated. The same gender roles were being expected of them inside the revolutionary movements, even though allegedly the people they were working with were trying to escape from that. So yeah, they were writing for this this magazine called The Vortex. It was distributed across the nation, including in Lawrence, Kansas. A lot of them said, hey, ask yourself why sex is used to sell everything from cars to movies to Playboy to underground papers. Just because Madison Avenue doesn't hit you over the head by calling their products, sex cars or whatever, doesn't mean you're not being exploited. And so they really dug into this idea that sex wasn't necessarily countercultural, because a lot of marketing forces were using sex at the same time that revolutionary people were using marketing forces, were utilizing it to create revolution.
Yeah.
If you can convince people in a radical sense that sex is liberatory, marketers are going to be like, well, Coca-Cola is liberatory because we support free sex and love and all of that. They're going to jump on that immediately. And so I think that's a much more nuanced perspective, where just because people are okay with everyone having sex and, there not being any limitations on behavior like there was in the past, doesn't inherently mean these people are in a better place. It might just mean they're being exploited in a different way. And I really like that thematically. I think that's a much more cogent conversation than all sex liberation is inherently good.
Yeah.
I've been talking for a while. What are you feeling about all of this?
I don't know.
You're along for the ride?
I'm along for the ride.
Excellent.
I think you're making good points.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Jumping back to the role of psychiatry. So a lot of college administrators have turned over their work to psychiatrists. Psychiatrists have said gay people are okay. There's a lot of sex liberation movements happening across the country and within Lawrence itself. And so there's a couple of student groups who are pushing for gay liberation groups on campus. And this becomes a subject of contention because they're not just asking for recognition of a student group, they're also asking for money from the university to put on things like socials and dances. And that's a really interesting conversation because all of a sudden they've taken something that was a relatively small thing impacting relatively few people, 6 people meeting in a basement every Tuesday, to something that impacts the state of Kansas.
Yeah.
Because the university gets its money from the
Publicly
state of Kansas.
funded, yeah.
I mean, this is back when universities were publicly funded,
Right.
not that that exists in the nation
Yeah.
these days. So there was a First Amendment issue where the University of Kansas said, hey, we're not going to give you money for the dances. We don't want your sort of behavior to be promoted. And they're like, well, this is our free speech. We're doing this as like normal individuals. You're discriminated against us on like the basis of our identity. We would like funding. So they took this to, I think, the Kansas Supreme Court.
Yeah, they did.
You know the details on this.
I know some of it, yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about it?
I know that much. I know that I know that they lost bad at the Kansas Supreme Court.
So the GLF brought this case to the Supreme Court. The judge's decision that ultimately voted against them centered on concepts of sexual morality and normality compared to their First Amendment rights. The judge concluded that public school authorities should be accorded the widest authority in maintaining discipline and good order in their institution. When the announced objectives and purposes of the Lawrence Gay Liberation Front are considered, it is not difficult to understand the concerns of the chancellor and his conclusion that the school funds should not be made available for the purpose of opposing or supporting the discussion of bizarre sexual activities for which the plaintiffs apparently seek formal and public approval. So this was kind of a strike. It was then appealed and went to the U.S. Supreme Court. And during the period of time which was being appealed, it continued to function in Kansas.
Yeah.
And the officials of KU during this period gave it funding and greater privileges.
Yeah.
They're like, you know what? This might be a First Amendment issue. We've already discussed this with psychiatrists. They don't consider it a big problem. Why can't we give them funding? So ultimately, they lost in the long term. But during the period of time when it was being appealed, they got a lot of money. They got an office in the student union, free access to space for meetings and dances. And the dances took off. They got crazy in a good way. So they describe dances as a key part of their strategy for making gay beautiful. In a town without established spaces for gay and lesbians, the irregularly scheduled dances were critically important. Open to all, men and women, town and gown, gay, straight, and otherwise, the dances held at the student union throughout the 1970s played a major role in creating and consolidating a gay culture and community in Lawrence. I'll jump in here. We were in Lawrence over winter break, and every single store, it seems, has a gay pride or a trans pride.
Yeah, Lawrence has a thriving
it is
LGBTQ
absolutely
community.
crazy. We walk into stores and, multiple people have, gay pride shirts on or, shirts that are suggestive of gay culture. And I was like, my God, I don't think I've seen this many gay people in San Francisco. It was crazy. So, obviously this worked to some degree. But the dances were intended to offer a space where people could relate out of their naturalness. This meant not only freedom for men to dance with men and women with women without fear of harassment, but also freedom from restrictive roles imposed by straight society. So harassment remained a real possibility. So some of the first ones in the spring of 1972, jeering spectators lined the balcony of the Union Ballroom. 4 or 5 young men during the end of the evening grabbed the cash box containing the evening's admission receipts, beat up the man who tried to stop them, and ran away from the money. But the dances really fulfilled their purpose. So a lesbian who was in high school in Kansas City in the mid-1970s remembers her first Lawrence dance. She was hanging out with a group of underage students at the mall when someone mentioned that there's a dance going on in Lawrence. Several hundred people were already there when we arrived, including many from Kansas City who would normally have been at the bars. People were dressed in everything from street clothes to high drag to gender fuck. I don't know what that is. People we talked to had come from Manhattan, Kansas.
Yeah, Manhattan, Kansas.
Wichita, Topeka.
The Little Apple.
And even Omaha for this dance. So they also ran ads in local papers. We are out to let you love the one you want, advertising their speakers bureau and rap groups and seminars and counseling service. But it was the dances that transformed homosexuality from concept to reality, from ideology to flesh. Some of the GLF stalwarts believed that transformation was the best thing that could have happened to them. Events like the dances were a form of street therapy, a therapy for once aimed not once at curing homosexuality, but at making gay beautiful. A picket and a dance can do more for the vast majority of homosexuals than 2 years on a couch, asserted the GLF. So this is, again, one of those instances where an administrator at KU could have been like, hey, we're not going to give you any more funding. We don't care about the appeal. We're not going to give you any funding, and we're just going to leave it at that. But because likely of the influence of psychiatry, and they do mention some of the individuals throughout the text who play a role here, they decided we're going to give them the same rights afforded to other people because we've concluded this can't cause any harm.
Yeah.
And as a result, the Gay Liberation Front now has money from the university where they can afford to put on larger and larger events they would not normally have had access to. And this creates this incredible queer space for that entire section of Kansas.
Yeah.
Where, again, people who did not normally have the ability to hang out with queer individuals during this period, had a safe space that they could indulge themselves and really participate in the formation of their identity. So that is just truly fascinating. Obviously, there were protests, there were pickets, there were people who caused all sorts of trouble and, really stressed out administrators. But a lot of this was smaller decisions being made at the administrative level that influenced the acceptance of gay people in this entire community. There is some weirdness during this period. Again, it's not like perfectly straightforward. A lot of women who were attempting to liberate themselves would form women's groups. Beth characterizes anger, not joy, as most of Lawrence's women liberations writings on sex. She does not describe Lawrence women exploring their sexuality and finding solace or comfort. She finds them mostly like a site of pain, a locus of oppression. There was strident or sarcastic anger, volcanic or oceanic anger. I thought I might be the rage, one of the voices in reading said. A second, I thought I might be the shout and the explosion that destroyed society. The women who came to the revolution fighting for liberation did not so much celebrate the liberating force of making love as fighting the exploitative power of sex. A large part of the oppression stemmed from the sexual exploitation of our bodies, stated one Vortex polemic. Women's bodies are used as tools to sell everything from cars to magazines. As such, women are viewed as objects, and it's difficult for a woman to walk down the street without being weighed, measured, and judged. This sexual exploitation reached from the anonymous city street and the newsstand into the intimacy of relationships. Relationships with men often became strained and artificial because the man has been taught to regard the woman as a method of satisfying sexual drives rather than an individual. Boy, that's a major theme on this podcast. The sexual revolution, the author claimed, had left women more exploited and not liberated. We rationalized the constrictive, puritanical attitudes out, but instead of being offered more human and more fulfilling relationships, we're given the other side of the same bullshit, the dehumanized role of the sex doll and the unpaid prostitute.
Damn.
Boy, howdy.
Spitting fire.
But again, when you hear about the sexual revolution, you think of it as a period of time in which women got more rights and more quote-unquote liberation. And I think that may be true in certain instances, but it's worth also hearing the other side of the coin, where a lot of women did not feel it gave them greater opportunities, but instead was utilized by male allies as an opportunity to get into their pants. And as they point out, just because we have the same rights doesn't mean we're still treated the same, right? Our bodies are still being used to sell all sorts of things. We're still treated as commodities, not as people in of ourselves. And I find that a really fascinating perspective that I think, unfortunately, still carries over 50 years hence.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it depends on which wave of feminism you're coming at the issue from.
Fair.
And I think that the tension between women wanting more choices and women actually being able to exercise those choices in a meaningful way has always been present and is still present today.
Right. Unfortunately, this is not just like people's feelings. This idea of sexual exploitation is like firmly backed up by data.
No, of course.
And so one of the big themes that happened in this period, even as there's like quote unquote sexual liberation and like freedom occurring, there's also a lot more reports of rapes. So in 1972, the number of rapes reported in Lawrence increased by 271% over 1971, even as the overall crime rate decreased by 4.4%. In absolute numbers, the change was somewhat less alarming, from 4 reported rapes in 1970 to 7 in 1971 to 26 in 1972.
Still.
At least 11 of those were committed by a single individual who was eventually convicted of the crimes. But the police department, being characteristically the police department, didn't give them a lot of cause for concern. Lieutenant Harrell of the Lawrence Police Department mentioned the abolition of the death penalty as an explanation for the growing number of rapes, and said the crimes sometimes were an indirect result of new freedom gained through activism. So he said, and he pointed up the students of the Haskell Indian Junior College. Haskell, okay. And he said they want to attend more taverns. They've often been drinking when they commit a crime. And their editorial that he wrote in the Kansan noted that these seemingly simplistic explanations by a policeman for the complex and frightening issue indicate a need for an intense investigation by the police into the conditions that allow rape to occur so frequently in Lawrence. So yeah, objectively, like, this was an issue. I think one could argue part of this is a greater willingness to report something as a result of people being more aware of the problem
and talking about
having the language to describe it. But simultaneously, there's also an indifference by the authorities to do anything about it, which is deeply frustrating. It really backs up this idea that liberation did not occur as neatly as we would like. Okay, so we've just got through like 150 pages in
Damn.
40 minutes, and I want to wrap up on one last section, which kind of puts into perspective how these changes were being perceived at both the local and national scale. So in Martha Peterson's first year as the president of Barnard College, right in the middle of a major fundraising campaign, she had been blindsided by an institutional scandal of national proportions. It started with an article in the lifestyle section of the New York Times. An arrangement, living together for convenience, security, and sex. This piece was not meant as an expose because the surrounding articles were A Cook's Guide to the Shallot and How to Duck the Hemline Issue. But this feature story, which offered a rather sympathetic portrait of several unmarried student couples who lived together in New York City, included an interview with a Barnard sophomore who rather naively, thank you, explained to a reporter how she had used loopholes in Barnard College's strict housing regulations to live with her boyfriend in a $100 a month apartment in Riverside Drive. $100 a month.
Oh my God. Dare to dream.
That? Not surprisingly, the article caught the attention of Barnard administrators who had little trouble identifying Susan in the article as Linda LeClaire. So the student says, hey, I'm living with my boyfriend. I'm not supposed to. I'm a sophomore in college. Whatever. Administrators are like, oh my God, she's living with her boyfriend. Keep in mind, this is still an issue.
Mm-hmm.
Gay people are fine.
Yeah.
Potentially having sex and getting pregnant in college, not so much.
Mm-hmm.
So she was charged and brought before the college judiciary committee, not for her sexual conduct, but for lying to Barnard about her housing arrangements. In a letter to the student newspaper, she argued that the housing regulations discriminated on the basis of sex, for Columbia men had no such rules. Noting that Barnard College was founded on the principle of equality between women and men, she asked, if women are also intelligent people, why must we be supervised and curfewed? Yeah, women, why do we have to supervise and curfew you?
My vagina just leads me to unbelievable places.
It's true. So the Student Faculty Judiciary Committee deliberated for 5 hours. In the end, it found her guilty of violating college regulations, but also called for reform to the housing policy. The punishment they recommended for her was she was barred from using the campus cafeteria.
What?
So it was like a super minor thing. The president refused to accept the council's decision. She said she had many years of experience as a dean of women. It is my inescapable conclusion that no useful purpose can be served by your continued enrollment at Barnard. She stipulated that the final decision would depend on her semester grades, but she dropped out of Barnard. Linda dropped out of Barnard for the end of the semester.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Barnard treats this as a college matter. Major newspaper discusses this issue. Barnard's like, look, we're going to treat this as like a violation of our policies. It might open up some opportunities to discuss these policies, but in the end, we don't like this and we don't think this conduct should continue.
Mm-hmm.
Very minor thing, except it's not. It becomes a national news media thing.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember was it 2011 when Sandra Fluke provided testimony about wanting access to birth control on her healthcare plan? Do you recall this?
I don't.
Yeah, it was like a young college student. I don't recall all the details, but I think she testified either to a state committee or to a national committee on wanting her healthcare plans to cover birth control.
Mm-hmm.
And conservative media ripped her to shreds. They called her every variation of the word whore. It was like absolutely destructive to her.
Mm-hmm.
And, obviously they wanted to push back about women asserting their right to have control over their health and sexuality. But yeah, this was another example of that. So the response was truly national, overwhelmingly negative in major newspapers. Francis Beeman of Needham, Massachusetts, suggested that Barnard should be renamed Barnyard.
Oh,
Charles
God.
Ornsinger of San Antonio wrote, if you let Linda stay in college, I can finally prove to my wife with a front page news story about a bunch of glorified whores going to Eastern colleges. A Presbyterian minister wrote from a small town in West Virginia. Quite frankly and quite bluntly, we had a name for girls like her when I was in school, which began with whore. An attorney from New Rochelle ventured the opinion that in all probability, LeClaire is being educated beyond her intelligence. Mrs. M.J. Payne of Bellingham, Washington, accused the president of the college of contributing to the moral decline of our country. You're opening the way for thousands of students to live an open, sinful, immoral living together. Frank Hosick wrote from Cleveland, thank the Lord I have no daughter attending Barnard who would be forced, even vicariously, to associate with, to put it bluntly, a reputed whore. Newspaper editorials, always known for being well-meaning and well-intentioned, were no more measured in tone. The Benton Harbor, Michigan News Palladium opined that chastity among women is an appropriate and reasonable moral characteristic to require of young ladies, explaining that any promiscuous women, even one who shares only the bed of the one man who won't tell, is a pathetic figure, either the butt of locker room jokes or destined to get the shattering brush off that ultimately comes to all trusting fuels. And William Buckley, whose column appeared in newspapers across the nation, expressed no surprise that the cares of the world shall multiply like rabbits, whose morals they imitate. You know, the famously immoral rabbits. I don't know what rabbits do besides breathe. It's so immoral. Is it eating carrots?
I don't know, man.
Yeah. Okay, so why am I going into all this issue at Bernard? Because the Bernard issue kind of indicates how on the national scale, a lot of people still did not believe men and women should be able to cohabitate when they were unmarried. Like, this was a big, big issue. So even as local colleges across the country were liberalizing their housing policies and making it more acceptable that men and women could live together, national news media was like, hell no, we're not going to support anything like that. And obviously culture supported that. Now, at the University of Kansas in 1970, keep in mind this happened in 1968, in 1970 a group of students began working with the administration to create a co-ed living situation. These weren't actually new at KU, because the first such experiment took place in 1959, and everyone who participated thought it was, like, really good. But it was, like, a new idea where they were interested in interacting with people, not to, quote, meet and date the opposite sex, like the people in 1959 had found advantages in doing, but to participate in a co-ed environment where men and women could be treated as peers and not just sex objects. Now, this was what they claimed, and arguably you could say that some of them were still interested in opportunities to pick up women, or women in opportunities to meet men. Like, that's certainly not off the table. But what they were discussing was, in theory, we go to a college which is meant to educate people and build better members of the community. And we don't have an opportunity to truly treat women or men as our peers if we don't have opportunities to interact with them in environments outside of, like, rigorous relationship rules. If we don't have opportunities to interact with them outside of, like, public dances and, like, events that the university puts on. The letter that they wrote, the proposal that they wrote, says it would contribute to the development of each resident as a full human being. Opportunities to formulate a self-concept based upon what one really is instead of standard rules would be increased. If a woman desires more spontaneous and thorough interaction with a male than typical male-female situations might afford, she could benefit from a situation in which they both wash dishes together. The same advantage could hold true for a male. In other words, what we aim to accomplish is opportunities for interpersonal relationships based on friendship and cooperative efforts rather than on the male-female roles we often play in dating situations. There were people who pushed back against it. Some people were like, the only goal would be having sex with, like, people in your dorm. There's no benefit to living together. But, like, ultimately, I think they made the point that if you're going to have a co-ed environment in which people are treated as peers, you have to apply that to all levels of their, like, living arrangements. You can't just have that in the classroom. The Kansan paper talked a lot about this. They thought it was, like, kind of ridiculous. They talked a lot about how there was hanky-panky occurring and a massive necking problem around campus. The brief article in the student paper became a television news story at McCollum Hall. Parents tied up the dormitory switchboard with calls around the state, most of them to their daughters and not sons, again, controlling their behavior so they don't get pregnant. Many people also disputed whether or not this was an issue. Like, one administrator estimated about 10% of his residents were involved in hanky-panky. Other dorm officials said it was only 50 couples, not 10% of the population, so not that big of a deal. Basically, this opened up the conversation about whether or not academia could be a place where men and women were treated with any semblance of equality. So administrators published a defensive document in 1969 as KU began to institute an open visitation policy. They said, while not fully accepting students' claims that such contact would destroy inequality and stifling sex roles, we do assert that companionship of persons in the opposite sex is frequently conducive to serious academic work, and they argue that open visitation would make life more normal and thus more hospitable to both intellectual and personal growth. So there's some things that, get in the way of this, but ultimately administrators are like, our goal as a university is to educate. They've moved away from this idea that the goal primarily is to, like, defend men and women from getting into immoral relationships and causing problems. And so ultimately anything that gets in the way of education is something that we should push back against. So they offer this co-ed dorm policy, people begin to live together, and as a result, co-ed dorms become a lot more popular in the state. I think that's where we're going to wrap up for today. Beth Bailey doesn't really get into it in the last section, but I might argue that there could be economic interests there as well, where administrators realize that an increasing portion of college costs are going to just keeping men and women separate, and it'd be far cheaper to like run a university if you don't have multiple people whose sole job is to like track student conduct. I don't know if there's evidence to support such a theory.
I don't know how strong of an argument that is. I mean, it's probably a small factor, but it's a small
The
factor.
whole theme of the book is small things add up.
But this is a very small thing.
You're right. I think there's a push during this period to rethink about what education can be, and that ultimately influences academics and administrators' perspective on how students should interact on campus, in the same way that during this period you had Black liberation majors opening up, Native American study majors opening up, entire new colleges dedicated to critical theory and queer theory. You had people rethinking not just about what the content of education was, but the context of education. And I think this was probably part of the larger national trend in that regard. How are we feeling?
Good.
I have no moisture left in my mouth.
I can tell.
Yes. What are we thinking of this book?
I think it's informative. I wish it was
A movie. Documentary.
No, not necessarily. I wish it was a movie or a documentary. But maybe it's just the way you took excerpts from it. But I wish it was more specific as to how, like, this was specific to Lawrence.
That's fair. You're not wrong that sometimes national trends in this text are extrapolated to Lawrence, but I think in most instances when she brings something up, she backs it up with content from zines, newspapers, letters to people, whatever at the time.
No, it's a very, I'm not disputing that it's a well-researched book. It's very well-researched.
A lot of what she talks about, she says, here are the broader national trends, and then here's how it impacts Lawrence. I thought it was more interesting to discuss the national trends in the context of how it might impact communities, because I think that's more applicable to most people's experiences. And I think there's lessons here about how to get policy changed and to get certain things accepted with regards to the economic and political factors at play, with regards to who you have to influence in order to get policies to change, with regards to how national media can influence the conversation, both positively and negatively. And then I think there's certainly a consideration here about how movements that try to generalize the problem and, say, we need sex liberation, often conflate a lot of different interests all at once, and how that can be negative for the people who are swept up in it. And I think that doesn't mean pause your activism. It doesn't mean, stop. It does mean if you're looking back at the history of activist movements, you should accept that it was not uniformly good.
Sure.
And you should be more critical of people who tie themselves to that activist legacy, because it could be that they played, a very negative part in how things came about. I especially don't like that, as the book points out, there was a lot of misogyny tied up in this period. You could argue that Playboy was helpful for a healthy, open conversation about sex in America, but also simultaneously creating stereotypical ideas of American women's value and beauty.
Yeah.
I don't think Playboy had like a non-white model until 10 years after they launched. And to this day, you can still argue about the body types that are, they don't have published anymore. I think they just have like a website, right?
I don't know.
I don't think there's a physical edition of Playboy anymore. But I guess to that point, Playboy kind of created the modern porn empires that we see today, and then kind of became a relic of the past because they couldn't keep up with the subversive content that other people were creating, and just became kind of this like relic of an older time. Certainly not the mark of sophistication and cutting edge political humor that they thought they were at the time. Any parting thoughts?
Nope.
I'm gonna read a book to you every night now.
Aw, that's so nice. Can we do Harry Potter next? Actually, no, not Harry Potter.
Yeah,
not Harry
I was gonna make that joke. Then I was like, let's do a series of unfortunate events.
Oh, okay.
A book that has positive themes about
sadness,
authority, and depression, and a lot of queer people, not necessarily identified as such, but pretty transparently coded in the text. Adventure, intrigue, fantastical, weird Victorian steampunk world. It's everything you could possibly want and more. Why didn't they make that into a movie?
They did.
Why didn't they make all 13 books into a movie?
Oh, I don't know.
I thought the Netflix show was okay.
Yeah.
I don't know. You know, if you can do anything today to make your life better, people, it's to read The Series of Unfortunate Events by Lemony Snicket. That's our takeaway. It's not... Activism is cool, and obviously the world's been influenced by a lot of different forces throughout history, from the local to the national. It's... Boy, that Lemony Snicket. What a guy.
Yep.
Thanks for tuning in, y'all. Fuck. We're going now.
Bye.
We have many thanks for the use of our theme music, which is the song Drop by Ketsa. You can find more of their music online at ketsa.uk. You can also find Date These Guys online on Twitter and Instagram at @DateTheseGuys or visit datetheseguys.org. If you have questions for the podcast or want to be a wealthy sugar parent, please send an email to datetheseguys@gmail.com. If you'd like to support our work, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/datetheseguys. We have behind-the-scenes information, early episode access, participation in polls, and exclusive access to a guy sibling map of date ideas for the Arizona area. Since the world sucks right now, we are currently donating all Patreon proceeds to trans organizations like the Trevor Project, a trans suicide prevention organization, and moving assistance funds for those fleeing states outlawing their very existence. Please consider becoming a member and supporting our work today.